The starched white linen of the tablecloth smelled of bleach and regret. Maya pressed her cheek against the fabric, the frantic beat of her own heart a muffled drum against her ear. Muted sounds filtered through the cloth. The clink of silver on porcelain. The low murmur of conversations she was paid to ignore. The squeak of her own rubber-soled shoes against the polished floor as she'd scrambled into the darkness. She had seen him come through the door, his smile the same oily thing that had ruined her life for a year.
Chad.
Her ex. She was supposed to be invisible here, a ghost in a red vest refilling water glasses. But he had seen her. So she had done the only thing she could think to do. She had dropped her tray of empty glasses and dove under the nearest table. She held her breath, listening for his voice, for the sound of his cheap shoes on the expensive floor. Instead, she saw 2 pairs of men's shoes. They were Italian leather, polished to a merciless shine, and they were perfectly, unnaturally still. She thought this was the world she was in, a world of bad ex-boyfriends and momentary panic. A world she could escape. However, the man whose legs were inches from her face did not move. Not a twitch. Not a single shift of weight. The silence from this table was heavier than any sound in the restaurant. A cold dread, far worse than the familiar anxiety Chad inspired, seeped into her bones. Then one of the shoes turned, just slightly, angling toward her hiding place. A low voice, smooth as aged whiskey and cold as the grave, cut through the restaurant's hum. Get up. The words were not for his companion. They were for her. And now she could not leave. Her breath hitched. For a frozen second, she considered staying put, pretending she hadn't heard. But the authority in that voice was absolute. It was not a request. Slowly, painfully, Maya pushed herself backward, crab-walking out from under the table, her cheeks burning with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. She could not bring herself to look at him. "I am so sorry," she whispered to the floor. "My tray?" I slipped. The lie was thin, pathetic. The silence stretched. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight pressing down on the top of her head. The other man at the table hadn't moved a muscle. He was a statue carved from granite and fear. "Look at me," the voice commanded. Maya squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment, then forced them open. She lifted her head. The man was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful. Dangerous. Inevitable. He wore a charcoal suit that was probably worth more than her apartment, tailored to fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was cut short severe. A faint, silvery scar cut through one of his eyebrows, the only mar on an otherwise perfect, cruel face. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of dark coffee, and they saw everything. They saw her fear, her lie, her pathetic attempt to hide. And they were utterly unimpressed. On the little finger of his right hand, a heavy gold signet ring caught the light. His hands rested on the table, one on top of the other. They were large, still hands. Capable hands. Before he could speak again, a new voice intruded, loud and unwelcome. "There you are. Maya, baby. What are you doing groveling on the floor?"
Chad.
He was standing a few feet away, a stupid, confident smirk on his face. He was everything this other man was not. Loud where the other was quiet. Cheap where the other was expensive. Weak where the other was something else entirely. "I told you not to contact me, Chad," Maya said, her voice trembling as she got to her feet. Come on. We had a good thing," he wheedled, stepping closer. "You can't just block my number. I just want to talk." "She doesn't want to talk," the man at the table said. His voice was still quiet, but it sliced through the air and made Chad freeze. Chad's eyes darted to the man, taking in the suit, the posture, the sheer, immovable presence of him. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "This is a private conversation, pal." The man didn't even glance at him. His dark eyes were still locked on Maya. "Is this man bothering you?" It wasn't a question of concern. It was a question of fact. A lawyer establishing a premise before a final, bloody argument. Maya could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. The man finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion. He looked at Chad. It was just a look, but under its weight, Chad seemed to shrink, the cheap fabric of his jacket suddenly looking cheaper, his confident smirk melting into a slack-jawed line of apprehension. "Leave," the man said. One word. A dismissal. Chad bristled, his pathetic pride warring with a sudden, primal instinct for survival. "Yeah? And who are you to tell me what to do?" The man didn't answer. He simply lifted one of his still hands and made a small, almost imperceptible gesture to a figure standing near the restaurant's entrance. A burly man in a dark suit, previously invisible to Maya, detached himself from the wall and started walking toward their table. He moved with a heavy, purposeful gait. He didn't look at Chad. He didn't look at anyone. He just came. Chad's bravado evaporated. He took a half step back, then another.
Fine.
Whatever. She's not worth the trouble anyway. He threw a last, venomous look at Maya before turning and practically fleeing the restaurant, the large man following him out like a shadow. The entire restaurant had fallen into a hush. Diners stared, forks halfway to their mouths. The other man at the table finally moved, placing a few $100 bills on the table before standing. He gave his boss a slight nod and walked away without a word. Maya was alone with him. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the now empty chair across from him. I have to get back to work," she stammered, her mind reeling. "Your shift is over," he stated. It wasn't a guess. "The restaurant will be closing soon. Sit down, Maya." He said her name. He must have read her name tag. But the way it sounded in his mouth was different. It sounded like a possession, like something he owned. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every flaw, every fear, laid bare for his inspection. "You chose a poor place to hide," he said finally.
I'm sorry.
I panicked. "Panic is a luxury," he replied, his voice flat. "It gets people killed." The words hung in the air between them. This was not normal. None of this was normal. This man did not belong in her world of spilled wine and rude customers. He belonged to a world of quiet threats and men who appeared from the shadows to make problems disappear. She had stumbled out of her world and fallen headfirst into his. And the door back had just slammed shut. He wasn't protecting her. He was assessing her. A liability. A loose thread. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that men like him snipped loose threads. He signaled a busboy, who scurried over, terrified. "Bring 2 glasses and the bottle of Barolo for my reserve." The boy nodded and fled. "I don't drink," Maya said quietly. "Tonight you do," Dante replied, his gaze unwavering. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm. But it was the calm of a predator, resting but always aware, always ready. "You and I are going to have a conversation. You are going to tell me everything about the man who just left. And you're not going to lie, because I will know if you are lying." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the truth of his words in the cold depths of his eyes. She had thought Chad was her problem, but Chad was just a pathetic memory. This man, this stranger whose name she didn't even know, was her future. And it was a future she was not going to be allowed to escape. His name was Dante Moretti. She learned this not because he told her, but because the restaurant owner, Mr. Salvo, had scurried over to their table, his face pale with sweat, bowing and scraping and calling him Mr. Moretti. Dante had dismissed him with a flick of his wrist, never taking his eyes off Maya. They sat in the empty restaurant for over an hour after the last staff member had nervously locked the doors, leaving them alone in the cavernous, silent room. The wine he had ordered was deep red, like blood in the candlelight. She had taken a few sips, the rich liquid doing nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird of her nerves. He drank his slowly, methodically.
He asked her about Chad.
Simple questions. How long she knew him, where he lived, what he did for a living. She answered truthfully, her voice small in the vast quiet. Every detail she gave felt like handing him a weapon. He's nobody, she finished pleadingly. He's just a mistake I made. He won't be back. Dante set his glass down. The sound was soft, but it echoed like a gunshot. Everyone is somebody. And men like that always come back, unless they are given a reason not to. He studied her face. You are a poor liar, Maya. You hid under my table not because you were clumsy, but because you were afraid of him. He wouldn't hurt me, she said, the words tasting false even to her. Wouldn't he? Dante countered, a ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile touching his lips. It held no warmth. Or, has he not hurt you enough yet? He picked up his glass again, swirling the dark liquid. He wore a watch on his left wrist. It was a simple, elegant timepiece with a worn leather strap, at odds with the perfect tailoring of his suit. It looked older, like it had belonged to someone else. She found her eyes drawn to it. His gaze followed hers. His face hardened, the brief flicker of cold amusement vanishing instantly. Do not look at that, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. The sudden shift was terrifying. It was a glimpse behind the mask, a flash of raw, unguarded pain. It was a wound. I'm sorry, she whispered, dropping her eyes back to her own hands, which were twisted into a knot in her lap. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence was different now. It was charged with his anger, his grief, whatever it was that the watch represented. When he finally spoke again, his voice was once more controlled, glacial. My driver will take you home. He stood, and she scrambled to her feet. He was taller than she'd realized, a towering, intimidating presence. He walked her to the door, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The touch was not intimate. It was a brand, a claim. His driver, the same burly man from before, was waiting outside by a black sedan that was so clean it seemed to absorb the city lights. Get in, Dante ordered. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was her chance. She could run,
Scream.
disappear into the late-night crowds of New York. But where would she go? He knew her name. He knew where she worked. And she had a sickening feeling that he already knew where she lived. Running felt more dangerous than obeying. So she got in the car. The ride to her small apartment in Queens was silent. The driver didn't speak a word. She watched the city lights blur past, her reflection a ghostly image in the window. When they pulled up to her building, the driver got out and opened her door. Mr. Moretti said to tell you to stay home tomorrow. The man grunted. Someone will be in touch. She nodded numbly and hurried inside, not looking back. She locked her door, leaned against it, and finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. She thought that was the end of it. A strange, terrifying night. But the next evening, as she was getting ready to leave for work, deciding to ignore the order to stay home, she found the tires on her bicycle, her only mode of transport, slashed. Both of them, sliced clean through with a sharp blade. It was a message, not from Chad. This was surgical, deliberate, a warning. She was his now, associated with him, and his enemies were watching. She stood there on the pavement, staring at the ruined tires, the city noise fading into a dull roar in her ears. She could go to the police. Tell them what? That a powerful man had scared off her ex-boyfriend, and now her tires were flat? They would laugh at her. She could pack a bag and run. Disappear. Start over somewhere new. But the image of Dante's cold, certain eyes filled her mind. He would find her. A black sedan, identical to the one from the night before, pulled up to the curb beside her. The back window glided down. It was the same driver. He stared at her, his face impassive. He didn't say a word. He just waited. The open car door was an invitation and a command. This was her choice. Her one, real choice. She could turn and walk away into the terrifying unknown of being hunted by his enemies. Or she could get in the car into the terrifying known of being possessed by him. She took a deep breath, the scent of city grime and exhaust filling her lungs. Then she walked to the car and got in. It was a choice born of fear, but it was a choice nonetheless. And as the car pulled away from the curb, she knew, with absolute certainty, that her old life was over. Therefore, a new, more dangerous one had just begun. He took her to a place that didn't feel like a home. It was a penthouse apartment in a sleek, anonymous glass tower in Midtown, the kind of place where residents never met their neighbors. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, all sharp angles and cold surfaces in shades of gray and black. The only warmth came from the sprawling city lights visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It felt less like a home and more like a cage. A beautiful, luxurious cage. "You will stay here," Dante said, standing in the middle of the vast living room. He had been there waiting for her. He hadn't asked where she wanted to go. He had simply had her brought to him. "Do not leave. Do not use the phone. Someone will bring you food." "For how long?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For as long as it takes," he turned to leave. "Takes for what?" she pressed, a spark of defiance flaring within her. He stopped, his back to her. "For my enemies to understand that you are not a weapon they can use against me." He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the glittering backdrop of the city. "And for you to understand that your life is no longer your own." He left. The lock on the door clicked shut with an unnerving finality. For 2 days, she lived in the silent apartment. A quiet woman brought her meals on a tray, never speaking, never making eye contact. Maya paced the floor, from the cold marble of the kitchen to the vast windows of the living room, feeling like a ghost haunting a life that wasn't hers. She was his prisoner. On the 3rd day, he came back. It was late. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes tight with exhaustion. He had shed his suit jacket, and his white shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He poured himself a whiskey at the bar without offering her one. "The family who slashed your tires," he said, his back to her as he stared out the window. "The Falcones. They believe that if they can hurt what is mine, they can hurt me." "I'm not yours," she said, the words stronger than she expected. He turned, a dark look on his face. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of her, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He smelled of cedar and whiskey. "Are you not? You sat at my table. You rode in my car. You are sleeping in my bed." He gestured to the apartment. "You exist right now because I allow it. That makes you mine." Before she could form a reply, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his entire body went rigid. "We have to go.
Now."
He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her toward a service exit she hadn't even known existed. "What's happening?" she cried, stumbling to keep up with his long strides. "They found us," was all he said. They moved through a sterile, concrete service corridor. The air was cold, filled with the hum of the building's machinery. As they reached the service elevator, 2 men rounded the corner ahead of them. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces grim. They were not Dante's men. Dante shoved Maya behind him, his body a solid shield. He didn't draw a weapon. His hands were empty. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet menace. "Falcone sends his errand boys," Dante said, his voice dangerously soft. One of the men lunged. Dante moved with a speed that was shocking, a blur of controlled violence. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and twisting. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the man screamed, falling to the ground. The second man pulled a knife. Maya's mind went blank with terror. She was going to die here, in this concrete hallway. But then her survival instinct kicked in. While the second man's attention was on Dante, she saw a large, red fire alarm on the wall behind them. Without thinking, she lunged for it, slamming her palm against the lever. A deafening alarm began to blare, echoing through the corridor. A red light flashed, bathing the scene in a hellish strobe. The second man flinched, momentarily distracted by the noise. It was all the opening Dante needed. He moved, disarming the man with brutal efficiency, the knife clattering to the floor. Dante drove his knee into the man's stomach, and he crumpled. Dante grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the emergency stairwell. "Clever," he said, his voice tight with adrenaline as they clattered down the metal stairs. They emerged in a loading bay, the alarm still ringing in their ears. Dante's driver was there, the sedan idling, the engine a low growl. He must have been alerted. They dove into the back seat, and the car peeled out into the night, leaving the chaos behind. The adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving Maya shaking.
She had done that.
She had pulled that alarm. She hadn't just been a victim. She had acted. She had helped him. She had crossed a line, choosing a side in a war she didn't understand. Back at a new safe house, a smaller, more fortified brownstone in Brooklyn, the silence between them was different. It was heavy with what had just happened. Dante stood by the window, his back to her again. "You should have run," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You wouldn't have let me," she replied, her voice steady. He turned to face her. His dark eyes searched hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold command. It was something deeper, more complex. Respect, perhaps. Or confusion. He didn't understand her. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She acted. He walked over to her, stopping just inches away. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was surprisingly soft. It sent a jolt through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with him. He said her name, Maya, and it was no longer the sound of possession. It was something else. A question. A confession. The silence that followed was the only answer they had. They had been bound together by circumstance, but now, something else was tying them. A thread of shared danger, of reluctant trust. He let her sleep in the main bedroom that night while he took the couch. It was a gesture of trust she hadn't expected. But she couldn't sleep. The events of the night played over and over in her mind. His violence.
Her choice.
His touch. Restless, she got up and walked into the living room. He wasn't on the couch. A light was on in a small study down the hall. Drawn by a curiosity she couldn't fight, she crept toward the open door. He was sitting at a desk, a file open in front of him. He was staring at a photograph inside it. She saw it clearly from her vantage point in the shadows. It was a picture of a younger Dante, smiling, his arm around another young man who looked so much like him, they had to be brothers. But what made her blood run cold was the other file on the desk, next to the photograph.
Her name was on the tab.
M-I-Y. And beneath it, a second photograph. It was Chad. There was a thick red line drawn through his face. The confession of their silent moment hung in the air, a fragile, dangerous thing. But now she knew the truth. He hadn't just made her ex-boyfriend leave. He had made him disappear. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had thought the danger was from his enemies. But the greatest danger had been sitting across from her all along, watching her with his dark, knowing eyes. He wasn't her protector. He was her keeper. And the monster she was hiding from wasn't outside the door. He was in the house with her.